Good morning. It's lovely to be here, and also lovely to see so many familiar faces. Hopefully, in time we'll see fewer familiar faces at gatherings such as these. But this is already a good start. Lots of people hadn't seen at these kinds of events before. So I'm a philosopher. You're not going to get any fake news from me. You might get some confusing, ambiguous, and unjustified claims that I leave inscrutable enough that you can't judge me negatively. But nothing false, never. A lot of the things that I'm going to be touching on in this half an hour have been alluded to, because something that I've been concerned with increasingly is the fact that we could be accused, at least those of us in what I'll call the reason-based community, have been caught unawares by the fact that there's so far fewer of us than we once thought was the case. And we should stop that from happening again. And instead of reacting with despair and throwing our hands up in the air, we should think about the ways in which we were caught unawares and try to stop this sort of thing from happening again. And certainly in terms of educating younger people who don't get subscribed to rampant kind of postmodernism or something like that, persuade them that there is something valuable in facts and evidence and reasoning, and to do so in a way that doesn't cause kind of tribal divisions to exacerbate, which I think is part of the problem too. So some of you might remember this movie from 2006 called Idiocracy. That's the president of the United States in this movie. And the movie detailed a cryogenic experiment where a university and an army librarian and a sex worker were sent into the future, I think 5,000 years or something like that. And they arrive in this future where this man is the president. He's like a WWE wrestler sort of figure who fires his machine gun into the air in rallies and so forth. The librarian has an IQ test, and it turns out that he's the most intelligent man on the planet, with an IQ of something like 72. And he rapidly becomes Secretary of the Interior, becomes Vice President, and later he becomes President. And then we move to today, and we, of course, are in this kind of world where we might like to think that the satire of Mike Judge in 2006 with the movie Idiocracy is a little bit awkwardly close to reality. And one of the things that is manifesting in this world we're living in is a kind of anti-elitism, where I think you can all understand that there is some good motivation for anti-elitism, in the sense that elitism pushed the boat out too far, or became complacent, or, in a sense, forgot. I think some of us have forgotten the idea that even if you are more informed or more thoughtful than the average, that you can also be wrong. And in fact, that perhaps you might be more likely to be wrong because one becomes blind towards your own blind spots. And furthermore, you become more and more able to justify to yourself why you're not wrong. You have all of the argumentative and rhetorical tricks at your disposal, and all of those things I think make it slightly more difficult to have that moment of humility where you realize that you're wrong. But another broader political aspect of this thing is that I think we can misdiagnose the problem. And when we look around the world and look at, I don't know, I'm very active on social media, some of you might be as well, where you look at these people shouting at you, which is what they spend most of their time doing, it's very easy to mistake the increased volume of those voices with an increased number. So I did go through a period of pessimism around the state of the species, and especially the South African version of the species, when it comes to debates. But over time you also realize that it's the same people, and it's the same people shouting ever louder, and that might be confused for a growth in their number. And perhaps it isn't a growth in their number, but if you believe that it is, that might lead you to the wrong solutions, might lead you to the wrong way of remedying the problem. Okay? So if it's a political and a messaging problem, which is indicated by the shrillness of the voices and the paucity of their arguments, etc., that's one thing. Or if it's better mobilization of that group, that's another thing. So take the Trump Brexit sort of thing. There we're not necessarily, at least in my reckoning, talking about a growth in numbers. We're talking about people who previously did not feel they had a voice, who are suddenly exercising a voice they didn't know they had. So we'd be making a mistake if we thought about that as an increase in a certain number of people who are fact-free or something like that. So that points to our strategy being something different. It points to some way of trying to draw them into the tent and persuade them that these are not the remedies they're looking for, etc. But absolutely the way not to do that is to tell them they're stupid. because doing so is exactly what causes them to react in the way that they did. It exacerbates the anti-elitist tendency. So all of the work that we do in science and science communication, and skepticism and all that, by all means, it's absolutely vital. But we should never forget that a large part of our job is the communication aspect, and that all involves politics. That all involves how to message things without making them too dumbed down, conveying still the important messages, but not in a way that triggers the so-called backfire effect, which many of you might know about. And here's the idea of the kind of psychological tendency we sometimes have to, when presented with facts or evidence that contradicts our point of view or that challenges our pre-established point of view, triggers a kind of visceral reaction. You don't like to be told that you're wrong. So instead of changing your mind, you instead double down on the falsity. You instead leave there more convinced of the false thing that you started out believing. So how we approach things that does not trigger this kind of backfire effect is critical. Because what a lot of the political research after the Trump election, for example, showed is that when you tell American conservatives that by 2050, sorry, 2150, no, what are we here now, 2070, by 2050 or so, the number of minorities is going to outrank or outcount the number of the current majority, as you know, is whites. They tend to shift more conservative. Okay, so you tell, they now suddenly feel under threat. So you might hope that people would say, oh, here's benefits of multiculturalism, we can all learn from each other, etc. But no, they shift immediately to a kind of zero-sum game thinking, where they think, oh, well, there's a limited pile of resources. You're telling me by 2050 I will have fewer of them. And that then makes them more xenophobe and more insular, etc. Okay, so we need to find some way to persuade people that it's not, that they're not under threat as much as they might think they are. So Nyhan and Riefler in, I think it was 2012, wrote this paper, 2010 rather, about the psychological consequence of telling people that they're wrong and how it can sometimes cause them to be more convinced that they're right. And a lesson that we learn here is that none of us are living as these agents of pure, detached reason, right? So even those of us who are a part of this reason-based community are also susceptible to these kinds of effects. But a second, or a more general thing that I want you to talk to you about today, is that when you talk about, or within the reason-based community, when you sit in gatherings like this, I think there's a fundamental premise that we hold, that we need to reevaluate. And that is the fact that people actually care about being rational in the same way that we do. So I'm a philosopher by training, and so I've spent the last 26 or so years reading and talking and thinking about philosophy and so forth. And it's always seemed to be, in a sense, axiomatic that what matters to people is facts and evidence and arguments, and you can persuade anybody that they should change their minds if you assemble the right kind of package of evidence and arguments and so forth. I'm going to call that a kind of detached rationality perspective. In other words, you believe it's ideal, it's an ideal, it's not in a sense necessarily practically ideal, because I think that the idea of being a moist robot, in Dan Dennett's phrase, comes with its negatives, because there's a certain amount of empathy and so forth, which is very important in our lives, right? So I'm not saying we should all aspire to be the Dr. Scott. I'm just using the phrase detached rationality as an expression of the ideal state of being unswayed by one's preferences and biases and so forth, and just following the evidence. We're comparing that to a kind of contextual rationality. And what I mean by contextual rationality is that, as Professor Velez was talking earlier on about the filter bubble, if you live in a robust and large enough filter bubble, where your entire community, your entire set of media sources, your fellow churchgoers, or whatever it might be, all agree with you, what is your incentive to be rational in the detached sense? What's in it for you? So you're living in a world where a certain set of falsehoods, where a certain way of looking at the world is absolutely rewarding, it's community generating, and to break away from that would be the thing that is disincentivized, because you would suddenly lose that peer group, you lose your support, you lose your family structures or stability or whatever it might be. The consequence could be that you were in a sense exiled or cast out. And remember, this is a community that has been formed on the basis sometimes of very strong emotional attachments in the first place. So you're averse to leaving in the first place. And if you do, you're going to exacerbate in your mind the possible consequences. So understanding that people might be living in a place of this contextual rationality, and also understanding what is in it for them to be what many of us in this room, I imagine the majority of us in this room, have always thought is self-evidently the right way to live, namely this abstracted and detached kind of version of rationality. That's an assumption which I think we need to question in our own minds quite strongly. There really isn't anything in it for them. And I've always gone to people with the arguments and not understood why they're not persuaded. And I think this is part of the clue as to why they're not persuaded. What is their reason to be? So unless you can offer some plausible account of how this filter bubble is eventually going to burst, and you are the rubber is going to hit the road, and you're going to face the consequences of the empirical reality up in your face, it's very hard to imagine this argument penetrating somebody whose filter bubble is large enough. And then if you look at things like a growing kind of right-wing nationalism in the US and the UK and France and Germany, etc., these things often take a long time to change. And we might be a bit too complacent about how we are going to get it to change soon enough. So yeah, what is the incentive? Take the recent events in America and look at that astounding stat. After the Roy Moore allegations come out that he molested a 14-year-old girl, 29% of Alabama voters say the allegations make them more likely to vote for him. A statement came out from a pastor 2 days ago, I can't remember his name, saying how we must remember that women are the greatest sexual predators. This is just a war against men, these allegations, and it's really not as big a deal as you think it is. Other people saying, well, there's Mary and Joseph. Mary is a child, Joseph was this elderly boy, elderly carpenter. Forgetting about the alleged virgin birth and all that stuff, leaving that factor, or that theoretical fact aside. Anyway, so there's the filter bubble can be very, very strong. I don't think we need to be as paranoid or as worried as some people would like us to think, because even though we are living in this weirdly post-fact world, people do still care about the truth. They just disagree on what the truth is. So take a conspiracy theorist, for example. They are more committed to truth than most of us. Okay, so it's again a misdiagnosis to say they don't care about the truth. They regard different things as evidence for the truth and disagree on what the truth is. But they're a very different beast to a pathological skeptic or to a postmodernist or something like that who actually has very deep definitions of what the truth is. So conspiracy theorists and postmodernists are not the same thing. And again, we need different ways of diagnosing and treating these two different kinds of ailments. Just to give you a brief moment of levity. A local example is Monica. This is from a book published last week, where I discovered that I'm part of a big conspiracy myself. I hope the paycheck is in the mail. But yes. So there's a game plan directed by myself and others to discredit a local scientist. So some of the reasons why truth is under threat are detailed in this very lovely book by Julian Virginia that came out about 2 months ago, called A Short History of Truth. He discusses science, and the problem with science and popular understanding of science without a robust education in how science works, without understanding that we're talking about a triangulation of the truth that can take a long time, where premises and conclusions are often hypothetical or contingent on later discoveries we might reach, etc. Okay, so you think of scientists as these authorities, as these gurus. So the very power of science to change our world can, in a sense, become this lever for giving up on truth entirely, because you see scientists change their minds. And you don't realize, because some scientists misrepresent this exact part of it, you don't realize that certainty was never part of the promise in the first place, right? So a responsible scientist will never present things in a manner which persuades you or tries to persuade you that there's this binary truth where I'm right or I'm wrong absolutely. He'll say, well, the current evidence suggests that I'm right, but maybe next year I'll discover that I'm wrong. If that's how people have always been told science works, they would never have gone down this route of thinking, well, science shows us that nothing is certain. That's the wrong lesson to learn. The lesson you should learn is the best consensus we have right now is what you should treat as being certain, even though you later on discover that it's probably not, or that you discover that it's false. But then meanwhile, you have to do things. You have to diagnose, you have to treat, etc. And the closest thing you can get to certainty is the best possible evidence you have. And so stop, I've been telling my students now for the last 12 years or so, to stop even thinking about the idea of certainty. Think about what's the best justified answer. That's the best you'll ever do, and go with that. Certainty is not possible, don't even try. Secondly, liberty. So we all know that democracy is a wonderful thing. We all know that political empowerment is a wonderful thing. But it's also come with this weird side effect that people now believe they're all equally knowledgeable to everybody else. So all opinions are special, all opinions should be respected, etc. All of these sorts of things come from this very good, on the whole, flourishing of individual freedom and liberty. Okay? But it's come at the cost of people forgetting that they need to be humble in the face of experts. That sometimes people know more than they do. And it's a difficult kind of balance to strike, because you want skepticism of expert voices. You want people to challenge and question. But at some point, if somebody who knows what they're talking about gives you a whole mass of data and explains something to you, it's really not your place to say, well, that all sounds very, very convincing, but I think you're wrong. Okay, so there needs to be that kind of recognition of hierarchies aren't necessarily bad things. Bad hierarchies are, and abuses of power are, but that's what all hierarchies are. So the decline of elites is the flip side of the personal liberty thing. Okay? All opinions are not equal, all people are equal, which means that you treat all opinions as a starting point. You treat them with respect. But as soon as the evidence shows that the opinion is faulty, you don't have any obligation to respect that opinion. And it's a separate issue from respecting the person. And people need to, in a sense, detach their personal self-worth from people interrogating and judging their opinions negatively. Globalization has confused people too, because suddenly you are faced with this vast collection of competing opinions, which again might persuade you that there is no absolute truth. But if you think about it another way, if everybody had access to the same data set, over centuries, these different nations that are mixed together in this global world would probably converge on the same opinions, right? But the fact is that we've got people melting together who have got different preconceptions, who've got different levels of education, who've got different priorities in terms of where their nation state is, etc. So it's not like we have any kind of stable baseline here. So it's a mistake to say, well, these 10 people from these different nations all have this different view, therefore there is no possibility of a consensus. No, that's just not an experiment that's been run, or hasn't been run for long enough. It might well be that we would converge on, for example, liberal democracy, if we had the time, and if we solved the socioeconomic obstacles to that, etc. Okay, so globalization doesn't prove that there's no truth. It just makes it more difficult to spot. And then lastly, the free press. The press is free, and that's, again, all these things are great things that have sometimes been midwives to kind of confusion. The free press, again, a fantastic thing, but that also means the press is free to spread misinformation, okay? To some extent at least. So that's what they sometimes do. And again, those of us who read attentively can do a little spectrum analysis and say that paper is to the left, that one is to the right, I'm going to read those two to balance my views out, etc. But again, if you're trapped in that filter bubble and you're just reading or watching your Fox News or whatever the case might be, you've got no reason to break out of that, because that tells you what you know is true. And it says so, it does it in an entertaining and affirming sort of way. So the point here is that, as I was saying at the start, all of these things caught us off guard because these things all struck us as good, and they are good. But there are these unintended consequences that came along with them that we perhaps were not sufficiently attentive to. And we've become afraid of consensus because of the skeptical impulse of not trusting what the evidence says. So 55% of climate, the public think that 55% of climate scientists agree on global warming, whereas the figure is in fact 97. That's because there's this innate attraction to conspiracy and to avoiding or denying consensus. We have the problem of what you've no doubt heard about of false balance. Last year there was this Wakefield movie that was invited by De Niro to screen at Tribeca, and then De Niro, public outcry, etc. De Niro eventually pulled it from the festival. But the movie involves all of these so-called vaccine-damaged children and plaintive descriptions from their parents about how vaccines hurt them, etc. But the Cochrane collaboration in 2012, and of course there's lots of research on this, I think it covered 15 million infants and found absolutely no link. And none of you need to be told this, I know. But there's absolutely no evidence for this link. But the public might believe that it's there, and they believe that it's there through this kind of false balance perspective, where you have the scientists saying this doesn't work this way, and then you have a sympathetic parent and a child who is ill, who has autism, and you present these things as if they're equivalent, and the public can't tell the difference. The problem with false balance is that it is exactly the introduction of that mother and child that introduces the bias. The bias wasn't there before then. Because if you've got a 97% consensus, like in the climate change thing, introducing the rogue 3% is disturbing. That's the thing that introduces the bias. Okay? Because they don't deserve a seat at that table, the adult table in a sense. So false balance is something we need to be very careful about in the media. If there is such a strongly evidence-based view on something, you don't have an obligation. And in fact, you have an obligation, I think, not to introduce that balance because you are confusing people. You are taking them away from what is the evidence-based point of view. As Christopher Hitchens reminded us, there's this, you can describe this chattering of panicked and nervous and whatever, understandably so, people as the exhaust fumes of democracy. Again, we have all of these benefits and wonderful side effects and consequences of increased participation and so forth, but without any humility or awareness that we are not all, in a sense, equally able to comment expertly on things. And these exhaust fumes of democracy confuse the issues because they lead to what's known as the easiness effect. A lovely paper from last year detailed how the public has become overconfident in their understanding of science. It's not just that you think you don't know, you actually now think that you do know. You become confident partly because your perceptions of claim validity in research is influenced by non-scientific knowledge, like what your family says or what your friends do. And we all know this from examples like homeopathy or placebos or whatever, where it worked for Aunt Sally. So I now believe this to be true. But the consequence here is that division of cognitive labor, where some people have one job to do and others have another job to do, and it's scientists' job to do the science, not Gwyneth Paltrow's. So that division of labor gets completely disrupted, and we end up exacerbating these confusions. Okay, I've got 7 minutes. I'm going to rush forward a bit. So we need to beware of oversimplification when we're trying to communicate this stuff, because we don't want to, in a sense, give our tribe, I'll use the word, of the reason-based community people, reason to become perhaps more right than the post-truth, post-fact people, but not for any better reasons. Okay, so I do care in a pragmatic sense about people having the right beliefs, but I actually care more for long-term sustainability, that they have the right beliefs for the right reasons. So if you've just persuaded them through force of rhetoric or through cult of personality to reach a conclusion that I happen to like, you're just as vulnerable to the next charlatan. So you actually would prefer to beware oversimplification and try to teach them in a way, to guide them to the correct conclusion in a way that doesn't encourage that kind of binary, I'm with you or I'm with the other person. And that to me involves us adopting a large amount of epistemic prudence. In other words, not making claims that are running ahead of the evidence that we have, not asserting ourselves in terms of certainty, as I was saying earlier on, conveying all the time that our premises, that our conclusions are provisional. They might be very strong, because we might have a lot of evidence, but they're still provisional based on current evidence, and that might change. Now, I know it's going to be difficult and counterintuitive for many of us to adopt that sort of view, but I think it's vital in terms of the long-term combating of this post-truth trend, to keep on reinforcing the idea that nothing is certain, but it can still be so darn well justified that any responsible person will believe it to be true. And a kind of humility, being willing and able to be wrong when the evidence shows that you are. The problem is that we've got this thing called the illusion of explanatory depth describes how we've now, in the internet age, mistaken the awareness that I know where to look for answers, I know which websites to look for answers, with the idea that we have understood the thing in question. Yes, the fact that you can go onto Dr. Google and look at your symptoms makes you more confident that you understand your health, or climate change, or whatever it might be. So the illusion of explanatory depth is telling us that an awareness of where to look for answers is making us more confident that we actually are in command of that information. And we're not at all. And if you add that to the fact that we do have this kind of echo chamber and filter bubble effect where you might be going to biased or prejudiced sources, you should be utterly unconfident that knowing where to look for something gives you the answers, because it might not be giving you the correct answers, and it certainly doesn't mean that you understand it better. So I think it was Rosenblit and Keel, the papers will come out, I'm sure, but it's all in the long-form version of this talk, suggested that we must focus more on explanations rather than reasons, because too often, because of this illusion of explanatory depth, we're inclined to just assume that there's a consensus or an awareness of an agreement on the conclusion, and just offer the reasons why you should believe something. Whereas this research suggested that you should rather focus on explaining, on guiding people through the thought process that gets you to that conclusion. So take healthcare. Instead of saying, all of us are equally entitled to universal healthcare because all humans are morally equivalent, or something like that. A better approach to persuade people of that conclusion might be to say, here's how much it will cost, here's how we plan to fund it, here's how much one will get paid, etc., and here's what its benefits are going to be for the society at large. So you guide them through showing your workings, showing how the kind of logic of the argument works to a particular conclusion. Okay, so that can defeat this illusion of explanatory depth, both for you and for them. Because in exercising your own argument, you can discover your own flaws or blind spots in it, and some more persuasively there. A second kind of trick or tip, I've forgotten the author, Fernbach was the author here. He spoke about inoculation theory, and there's he ran an experiment with climate change and presented a conspiracy, similar figures to the one I showed you before, presented a conspiratorial figure about climate change and how few scientists agreed with it, alongside a kind of disclaimer saying, here is what hyper-skeptics or conspiracy theorists are saying about the science of climate change, and here's why they're wrong. And presenting the misinformation to them with an inoculation, in a sense, device, made them far less likely to fall prey to those mistakes. So the suggestion is that you say, here's the facts of the matter, here's the myth or the misinformation about the matter, and here's the mistakes made in that myth as a kind of package. So when we are trying to present our own scientific findings or any kind of public communication around science, and in addressing the mistakes, it might be useful to present them in that kind of package. And then to kind of wrap to my conclusion, I think we should focus a lot more on on kids, and starting in the beginning. A lovely experiment ran in Uganda 2 years ago had children provided with cartoons and comics about scientific reasoning. And in this particular trial, they told them that red M&Ms can cause either kind of alertness and awakeness and faster writing and drawing, or can cause stomachache and dizziness. And they just said to the kids, figure this out. Is this true? And the kids tried to do a little RCT at the end of the day. They first had some kids eating red ones and some kids eating blue ones. And then one of the kids, or some of the kids, said, hold on, I can see what you're eating. This isn't going to be a good experiment. And they figured out by themselves, and they were between 10 and 14 years of age, they figured out by themselves that we need to actually do some masking here and do some double blinding and whatever. So, and they put together quite a short little lesson pack with some basic information and showed remarkable improvements in detecting bogus health claims from real ones in children. So more of that, because then they don't grow up into adults who are far more difficult for us to fix. Okay? And I think it'd be far cheaper to do it then too. And then for adults, you all know resources like this, but we need to understand how we make mistakes, understand the scientific method, and point people to useful, and there's lots more, I'm sorry if I left anybody out, resources that teach us about things. I'm going to skip that and go to this. Final slide. I've kind of put this in most of the talks I give because I think it's so vital. This discussion about humility and epistemic prudence and all that sort of thing, I think is beautifully captured in Dan Dennett's formulation of Anatole Rappaport's rules for debate. And as I said at the top there, it's not only about being right. I keep on trying to remind people that it's about how we demonstrate our arguments, how we reach our conclusions, rather than just about being right. Because if you're just smugly and assertively correct, then I think you sound just like the people you're trying to combat. So Rappaport's rules for debate say, start by expressing your opponent's position so fairly, so clearly, so vividly that they might say something like, damn, I wish I thought of that way of putting it myself. Now what that does is that it gets you emotional buy-in. It tells them that you are fair. It tells them that you are worth talking to. Secondly, list any points of agreement. And that might be as simple as an emotional hook, right? So I understand why you feel threatened. by the immigrant population or whatever. So you're going to go and tell them that they're wrong, but you can start off by saying, this is unusual in your little Northern England town, or whatever. Sorry. So you might have, you might find some sort of emotional buy-in like that. Then you would mention anything that you've learned from your target, and only after that attempt any rebuttal or criticism. By that point, you've made them receptive to hearing what you have to say. Instead of what our normal approach is to hit people over the head with your logic stick, assume the job is done, and walk away, and you've probably not changed the mind, and you probably never will with that strategy. Thank you very much.